go here, we asking permission. Part-time native on somebody else's land. These publications been tripping, I swear they don't understand. Pulling pictures to fit the image like I ain't growing up. I be telling my story when I don't know who I am. But I talk good, cover my insecurities, take another offer. Cover my anxiety, tell my mama it's all good. I feel the resentment from my homies and it's awkward. They see I'm losing my way, don't give a fuck that I'm sponsored. They wanna see me prosper, not just cop another dollar. They see the world I'm swimming and killing me, it's so toxic. Love sick, so sick of what I'm in love with. Patterns I'm falling victim to, can't help it. Abuse powerful and I'm on myself. I thought space would be good for my health, but I'm sick. I'm so sick of being sick. We'll be okay. I lost only no directions. Love showed me the way. We go here, we asking permission. If you need me, I can stay. I lost only no directions. Love showed me the way. We go here, we asking permission.
I ain't got time to waste, but I'm chasing still. Fantasies of love I pray is real, trying to play the field. Lost filling my gaps, scattered with my past. No trust, splitting homes like borders in the sand. No role models for real love. Every family that I grew up around, broken and hella need love. So much dysfunction to speak of. Mama told me good men are rare, she counting on me to be one. Too many vacant fathers run from themselves, afraid to face the mistakes and the lies they tell. That's a first-hand experience. Second-hand for every cousin, sister with different daddies who let them then wondering why they leaving us. Cycles of this trauma, what they leaving us. World so cold, we ain't even believing us. 500 years and my people still ain't free enough. Somehow, we still gon' believe in love.
We'll be okay. I lost only no directions. Love showed me the way. We go here, we asking permission. If you need me, I can stay. I lost only no directions. Love showed me the way. We go here, we asking permission.
There are ways I could take this. I know when I look into your eyes that we gon' float on when the waves hit. All this love lost, so exhausted, running out of excuses and patience. But I know when I take my time, I give a little more space for these changes. I feel like it's all changing.
Sick of being sick. I'm so sick of
que si usted estuviera donde usted quisiera, ya anduviera allá, pero llegué yo. Shout out pa' mi amor. Yo le veo los ojos y esa mirada cansada que quiere llorar y me dice no traigo nada, no traigo nada. Yo sé que si usted viviera como usted quisiera, ya anduviera allá. Cruzó la frontera, apostó vida entera por un porvenir y ganas de ganar y a todos ayudó. Y nada nos faltó aunque nos dijera no traigo nada, no traigo nada. No, dígame que no. Como los consejos que usted me enseñó y lo que me regaló. Váyase con paz y fe, aunque nosotros por dentro lloremos, por fuera no traigo nada, no traigo nada. Ay, oh, ahora mi hijo ya creció. Preguntó qué tienes, me limpié los ojos cuando me miró. Y yo con los viles y estreses y extraño a mis jefes, los ojos llorosos, le dije no traigo nada, no traigo nada. Ya se fue su mamá, no la pudo ver. Ahí quedó su papá y ganas de volver. ¿Y de qué me sirve el dinero si solo me quedo sin todo lo que quiero y no traigo nada, no traigo nada? Ah, no, dígame que no. Como los consejos que usted me enseñó y lo que me regaló. Váyase con paz y fe, aunque nosotros por dentro lloremos, por fuera no traigo nada, no traigo nada. Yo sé que si usted estuviera donde usted quisiera, ya anduviera allá, pero llegué yo.
Nacer en un pueblo bajo y no tener fama. El varón de la familia, gran responsabilidad. Salí de mi pueblo para poder progresar. Cruzar un desierto sin saber si volverá. La gente critica más, no ven la realidad. El frío sí es canijo, pero el hambre es mucho más. Les dije a mis padres, pronto volveré para atrás. Hoy vengo con la mente del poderme superar.
What's happening, everybody? Thank you so much for jumping on and joining us tonight. We're really excited to be here online with you all. We know Mondays are after work are extremely precious time, and so we're not taking that lightly. It's really important to us that you chose to spend an hour and a half with us. So as folks are still coming in, please drop a note in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what brought you here tonight. We love seeing where our community is at. So I'm your host today, Antonio Serrano. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the advocacy director for the ACLU of Wyoming. And right now I'm posted up in the south side of Cheyenne. This is where I'm raising my family. This is where I call home. I was born and raised here in Wyoming. I love this state. And for the past 8 years, I've had the privilege of being able to be part of the ACLU Wyoming, advocating for the state I love and the people in it who get ignored and pushed to the side. Before we jump into the conversation with our special guests, I want to start tonight with acknowledging why we're here. So we're here because our neighborhoods are under attack. ICE, local police, and sheriffs are targeting our neighbors, our friends, and our families. We at the ACLU see what the community is going through, and honestly, like, I feel your hurt. We also know that people in power are not being honest with us. They're indiscriminately sweeping up massive numbers of people while calling it safety and security. Across the country, so far, approximately 400,000 immigrants have been arrested, and it's estimated 100,000 children have been separated from their parents. In Wyoming, people being arrested without any criminal charges made up all of ICE arrests from November 2025 to January 2026. And 96% of those people arrested without charges were then detained by ICE in Wyoming. So this is happening in Wyoming jails, led by our sheriffs. And we at the ACLU, we ain't standing for it. So we're here because we're fighting back. And many of you here this evening are here to learn about the lawsuit that we filed on May 26th, challenging the Laramie County 287G agreements. And we're excited to share more information about more information about that with everyone during this forum. Before we get into the discussion with our panelists, I want to run through a quick housekeeping thing. I'm going to give you a preview of the agenda and what we're going to talk about tonight. Then we'll jump into the conversation with our panel. On housekeeping, we'll have around 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. Throughout the evening, drop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. My colleagues will be keeping an eye on that. So, and also just as a heads up, we're recording this so that more people who can't be here tonight can check on it later. One note on privacy, we know that's important. We've disabled the chat function, and if you ask us some questions, you can choose to do that anonymously. Your name will not appear in the recording, and we will not identify anyone by name when we lift up your questions during the Q&A. Because we're recording this, we have also disabled the mic function. But again, please send us notes, questions using the Q&A function. And finally, we have a live captioner, Claire Baldy, with us for captioning. You should see an option at the bottom of your screen for closed captions. Click on that button and then select Show Subtitle, which will show the captions along the right-hand side of the screen. All right, here's what we're going to be covering. We're going to talk about the lawsuit we recently filed challenging the Laramie County's 287G agreements with ICE. But we want to step back a little and explain the 287G agreements, what they are, and how local law enforcement is being pulled into federal immigration enforcement. Then we'll dig into what it looks like across Wyoming, and especially right here in Laramie County. We'll talk about the harms, what we're already seeing, and end with the ways that you can plug in if you want to stay engaged and stay part of this fight. So now I'd like to introduce our two panelists for tonight, Libby Screen and Andrew Malone. Libby is our executive director for the ACLU Wyoming. She grew up in Iowa, where she went to college and law school. She practiced law for a few years before she took her dream job with the ACLU. Since joining the ACLU, she's been a lobbyist, an advocate, and a policy expert. 12 years later, she's still here, but now she's fighting for civil rights by leading our team. Andrew is our senior staff attorney with the ACLU Wyoming. He grew up in Georgia, and he has been with the ACLU for 8 years. As a senior staff attorney, Andrew develops and litigates cases and participates in non-litigation advocacy to advance civil liberties and civil rights. Also with us tonight online is Caitlin Densler, our Deputy Executive Director, Jana Farley, our Communications Director, Sarah Parkin, our Digital Communications Associate, and Sarah Larson, our Office Manager, who is the tech wizard keeping this whole thing going. All right, now that we've introduced ourselves, let's jump into it. So I've got several questions for Libby and Andrew, but don't forget to drop yours in the Q&A as we go along. Libby, let's start with you. For folks here tonight who might not already know us, what is the American Civil Liberties Union and what type of work do we focus on?
All right. Well, hi, everyone. First of all, I am really, really glad to be with you tonight. A big thank you for spending your Monday evening with us and tuning in. And thank you, Antonio, for the question. So, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Wyoming, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with a pretty long history, right? So we're here in Wyoming, but we're also part of a national organization that was originally founded in 1920. With the goal of protecting and enhancing civil liberties and civil rights. Our mission is that we dare to create a more perfect union, beyond one person, one party, or one side. For us, that means that we work to make the promises of the Constitution real for everyone, and not just on paper, but in everyday life. That means that we protect people against government overreach and abuse. We defend the right to free speech, to free press, to peaceful protest, due process, equal protection, and privacy. We do this work by focusing on what we think of as three main levers. That's impact litigation, it's advocacy and lobbying at the state and local levels, and it includes public education. Right now, here in Wyoming, our top priority is immigrants' rights, and specifically, that means pushing back against 287G agreements.
Thanks for that overview, Libby, and for setting up the next question for you. Shifting into 287Gs, what exactly are 287G agreements?
Yeah, so let's get right into it. To put it plainly, 287G agreements are contracts where local law enforcement agencies, so like a county sheriff's office, signs an agreement with ICE to allow local law enforcement to perform immigration enforcement activities that they otherwise would not have the authority to engage in. These agreements are completely voluntary, and most law enforcement agencies in the country do not participate in them. However, these are one of the main tools that the federal government is using to enact its mass deportation scheme, because these agreements tap participating state and local law enforcement to essentially act as ICE's force multiplier. These agreements themselves are not new, right? 287G agreements have been around for years. However, under the current administration, the program itself has really exploded. So at the start of Trump's second term, there were 133 state and local agencies participating in 287Gs. Since then, ICE has signed over an additional 1,000 agencies to the program, with some agencies signing multiple agreements. At least 77.2 million people, which is about 32% of our country, now live in a county whose local law enforcement has enlisted in ICE's program. By last September, the Department of Homeland Security said that it had trained or was in the process of training more than 10,000 officers under one of the program's street-level models alone. I think it's really important to note that in our country's history, we have never had a deportation force of this size operating in the interior of this country.
Libby, you just said something about the program's street level model, which is also known as the task force model. What are the different types of models of 287G agreements that local law enforcement can enter?
Yeah, Antonio, that is a great question. So there are 3 different models of 287G, and the distinction between these really matters because these models extend immigration enforcement in progressively deeper ways, from local jails to traffic stops to job sites. So let's unpack these. First, we have the jail enforcement model, which is where deputies inside jails screen people who have already been booked and flag them for ICE. Next, you have the warrant service officer model, which are sometimes called 287G Light. These models are where deputies serve and execute ICE administrative warrants on people who are already, again, in their jails. Third, we have the task force model. And now this is the most aggressive and also the most controversial. These models deputize officers to investigate immigration status out in the community during traffic stops, checkpoints, and out on the street. The Obama administration actually phased out this model in 2012 because of widespread civil rights abuses, most famously by Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, Arizona. During the first Trump administration, this model was not even brought back.
Thanks, Libby. That it's good for folks to know about this so that they can understand better what their sheriffs and counties are really signing on to. Could you also tell us why the ACLU is focused on 287G agreements right now?
Yeah, I mean, in short, we are focused on 287G agreements because they are one of the single biggest mechanisms for expanding mass deportation right now. So the impact of these agreements land on us locally, in counties, in jails, and on highways. What we are talking about is not abstract federal policy, right? It is your sheriff's deputies at traffic stops and on your neighborhood streets. Nationwide, the ACLU has researched 287G under previous administrations, and we already knew that this program was problematic. What we're documenting and seeing right now across the country is even worse. We are seeing planned traffic stops and checkpoints used for racial profiling. We're seeing show me your papers becoming the working practice of state and local police. We're seeing the use of facial recognition, the majorities of civil immigration arrests bearing no relationship to serious crime, and we're seeing real damage to community police relations because people don't know if local law enforcement is there to help or if they will suddenly end up in ICE detention because they called 911 for help. Trust was already tenuous, but local law enforcement involvement with agencies that are frequently engaged in civil rights violations is leading to more distrust, and it's leading to avoidance of law enforcement. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, straight up. Some people might see this stuff in the news and recall what ICE and the Department of Homeland Security abuses look like in Minnesota and other cities, but they may not realize what's going on here in our own communities. Libby, can you tell us what cooperation through 287G looks like across Wyoming? And Andrew, coming at you next. Well, after what are we seeing specifically here in Laramie County?
Yeah, so I hate to tell you, but Wyoming is not on the sidelines here. Unfortunately, the map of 287Gs in Wyoming keeps growing. So as of right now, there are 8 Wyoming counties. Those are Campbell, Carbon, Crook, Laramie, Lincoln, Natrona, Sweetwater, and most recently Hot Springs. All of these counties have 287G agreements with ICE. In April of this year, there are 4 Wyoming towns that also joined. Those towns are Wheatland, Shoshone, Pine Bluffs, and Moorcroft. All of those signed task force model agreements. And remember, like we just talked about, that is the model that was retired in 2012 because of civil rights abuses. And now we've got Wyoming towns with populations of a few thousand people signing on to them. Additionally, the Wyoming Highway Patrol signed a task force model agreement, which Governor Gordon formalized in July of 2025. The pattern across these counties is one that we at the ACLU of Wyoming warned every Wyoming sheriff about back when we sent them letters last year. We're seeing contracts signed quickly, often without robust public process, and sometimes with zero public notice at all. And these contracts are being pitched to the community is about apprehending offenders who are the worst of the worst. And yet, actual operations are showing that the vast majority of people who are being detained have no criminal record. They're ordinary local drivers going about their daily lives. Sometimes they are commercial truckers passing through, and they've been Cheyenne locals who have come into contact with officers when they're out and about. We know that Wyoming has a small immigrant population in terms of raw numbers, but the impact of these programs is concentrated, right? Latine Wyomingites and people who are simply perceived as immigrants because of maybe the color of their skin are now navigating daily life knowing that a routine traffic stop in their county or out on the interstate can put them on a track to deportation. There's also one more piece of this that I really want to underscore, and that is that not every Wyoming sheriff has signed on to a 287G agreement. Sheriff Appelhans in Albany County hasn't seen the need to enter into 287G agreements, for example. So I want everyone to keep in mind that when a sheriff does sign on to one of these, it is a choice and it's not a mandate. So I think, Andrew, I'll kick it over to you for the piece that I think is the starkest, which is what's happening in Laramie County.
Yeah, thanks for that, Libby. As Libby was just saying, we really feel that anywhere these agreements are in place, there is going to be harm to the community. But it's really worth noting that Laramie County stands out for a handful of different reasons. First, I'd like to say that it's one of only 2 counties in Wyoming, the other being Sweetwater County, that has signed all 3 of the models of the 287G agreements that Libby was just talking about a minute ago. So those are the jail enforcement model, the task force model, and the warrant service officer model. So what we're seeing here is that the sheriff really isn't just helping ICE inside the jail. He's actively training deputies to act as immigration agents out in the community. He's doing everything he can to work as closely as possible with ICE. Another reason that this really stands out in Laramie County is the county's home to about 17% of Wyoming's population. And so we view this as an issue where what happens in Cheyenne isn't a fringe case study. It's actually setting the template for what could go on, in the rest of the state. And third, we are able to see how the sheriff is aggressively operationalizing these agreements. We have some good numbers for this. So in October 2025, that was when Sheriff Kozak and 23 of his deputies were first sworn in by ICE. So it started with 23 deputies sworn in to participate in this program. As of mid-May, that number went up to 30 that had completed ICE training, up from those original 23. So over a handful of months, the number increased substantially. Also, as of mid-May, the office had done roughly 300 immigration arrests through the task force model agreement since October 2025 when they started being deputized. And we have every reason to believe that number is just going to continue to climb. We also, seeing how they operationalize this, we have a really decent picture of what these on-the-ground operations actually look like. A few of these have been big trucking operations. There was a big trucking operation in November of 2025, which led to 40 immigration arrests, another in February of 2026, which led to 32, and one in April of 2026, which led to 53. And as part of that April one that I just mentioned, it's worth noting that during just 1 week last month, from April 17th through April 23rd, 1 week in April, it was the Laramie County Sheriff's Office made more immigration arrests through their 287G program than any other local or state law enforcement agency in the entire country. So Laramie County was number one. The entire Florida Highway Patrol was in second place, and that was with 31 immigration arrests as compared to the number of 53 that we saw in Laramie County. So the small Wyoming County was leading the nation in these immigration arrests through these 287G programs. And Libby was talking about these are often sold as getting the worst of the worst, but of the 53 arrests, only 3 of the people had any local charges or prior misdemeanors. That's any of the people that through this program that Sheriff Kozak had branded as Truck Around and Find Out Operation Spring Break. And after that operation, Sheriff Kozak posted a Facebook video from his patrol vehicle. He was wearing a cowboy hat. He said, "Welcome to Wyoming. We want you to come, but if you're going to come here to break the law or you're breaking the laws of our country, then turn around and go right back where you came from."
Yeah, I remember seeing that video, and I remember the video of him wearing his Truck Around and Find Out hats. I'm curious about the cost of all this too, and what that could mean for taxpayers here in Wyoming.
Yeah, so obviously the cost is a really important component that I can see people wondering about. To be honest, we don't have all the information about this. I can tell you some of the information we do have. For instance, we know that the 287G agreements that Sheriff Kozak has signed, they require his office to incur substantial expenses. In the language of the agreement itself, it makes clear that the Sheriff's Office is going to carry out these actions at its own expense. Now, there is an option for the sheriff to get reimbursed for those expenses, and so far that appears to be happening. We've seen some reporting from WyoFile that as of February 28th of this year, the federal government had reimbursed the sheriff's office for about $312,000. But I just want to go back to this point from a minute ago. Those reimbursements are not guaranteed. The agreements themselves say you have to do this work. You incur the expenses whether or not you get reimbursed. So that means at any moment, and we've seen some counties around the country and in Wyoming have trouble getting reimbursed. So at any moment, if the federal government stops doing those reimbursements, it exposes Laramie County to this issue, and it's just going to completely drop it with taxpayers footing the bill. Yeah, and just one final thing that I'd like to just underscore with that is, all of those things make this a problem for the community, but there's something else that turns this in from a political or humanitarian issue into a legal problem. And that's the fact that Sheriff Kozak signed these 3 agreements unilaterally. There was no public hearing, there was no county commission vote, constituents didn't have an opportunity to weigh in on a decision, and this is a decision that fundamentally changes what the sheriff's office does. You've just heard some of those numbers. It really substantially expands the operation of the local county sheriff. It also exposes Laramie County to enormous civil rights liability, and it just completely reshapes the community's relationship with local law enforcement, and all that was done unilaterally.
Thank you for all that, Andrew. Yeah, it's really important to know what's happening across Wyoming with these 287G agreements because it's all connected to the larger deportation machine that's destroying our communities. These communities mean a lot to me personally. I grew up here in Wyoming, and I lived everywhere from the ranches to the tiny Wyoming towns to the big old city of Cheyenne. And the way that we do things in Wyoming was always drilled into me. And it started early, from very young, my dad taught me work hard. The people I grew up around showed me how to respect other people's freedom and how they live their lives and to show up for your family, your neighbors when they need it. And that's the lens that the ACLU brings to this. Just like we do, that is what is happening under Wyoming's 287G agreement. The federal government is reaching down and using our local sheriffs to do something that goes against who we are. And many of our sheriffs are going along with it when they have every choice to not do it. They don't have to do it, but they're choosing to jump into this. Okay, so we know how big the program's getting here in Wyoming. Let's talk about what that actually does to people. Libby and Andrew, what are the harms that we're seeing both nationally and on the ground here?
Yeah. So this is such an important question, and I really want to spend some time talking about what this does to people, both non-citizens and US citizens, because the harm here is so much broader than many folks realize. I think first, for undocumented Wyomingites and mixed status families that they live in, 287G doesn't just create the risk of a single arrest, right? It fundamentally reshapes ordinary life. And unfortunately, the experiences of some folks tuning in tonight, some folks may be experiencing yourselves, or the stories you're hearing from other people in your community are part of a much larger scale pattern of abuse and harm that we're seeing happening nationwide. So for example, what we're hearing from folks in community is that people are telling us that they're putting off medical care because something as routine as driving to the hospital or the doctor's office can suddenly carry the risk of detention and possibly family separation. We are hearing that parents are afraid to drive their children to school. DACA recipients have reported being afraid to drive or even to be a passenger in a car because they could be swept up into the mass deportation machine and be separated from their families. All of this has serious public safety consequences for everyone in our communities. Because when people and immigrant community members in particular no longer know whether the local sheriff is going to report them to ICE, that's how trust breaks down. People stop reporting crimes, they stop calling 911, and they stop cooperating as witnesses. Survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and labor exploitation in particular are often the first and the hardest hit when situations like what we're experiencing start happening in our communities.
You're spot on, Libby. The harm happening in our communities, it's straight up real, no matter what anybody tries to say. And we also know that these programs don't stay narrowly targeted. Again and again, they expand into broad dragnet style enforcement. Just next door in Idaho, 200 federal, state, and local agencies descended on a racetrack where families had gathered, arresting more than 100 people, zip tying kids, children, and detaining some U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents in the process. In fact, our colleagues at the ACLU of Idaho are now suing to hold the government accountable for the seamless harm and trauma that they inflicted at this normally happy race day event. Libby, can you tell us more about how this impacts the broader community?
Yeah, absolutely. To put it simply, it has huge consequences. This enforcement does not only impact undocumented immigrants. We are increasingly seeing lawful permanent residents, DACA recipients, work visa holders, and even US citizens swept into aggressive immigration enforcement actions. One of our central concerns here is, of course, racial profiling, right? Multiple studies, including ACLU research, have found that when local police are deputized for immigration enforcement, race, ethnicity, language, or accent far too often become proxies for suspicion. And that is how a minor traffic stop can quickly become an immigration investigation. All of this is a big shift from targeted to dragnet enforcement, like you mentioned, Antonio. And in that scenario, that is where large numbers of people are stopped, questioned, or detained first, and immigration status is sorted out later. I think it's also important to name that Wyoming has legislatively expanded that pipeline of folks who are coming into contact with law enforcement. I'm sure a lot of folks listening today are aware of HB 116, which has been in effect since July 1st of 2025. That is legislation that voids licenses issued to undocumented drivers by 21 other states. And what this law does is it turns ordinary driving into a misdemeanor that can trigger ICE custody. The Laramie County Sheriff's Office runs that exact playbook. So, in practice, that law turns every stop on one of those 21 state licenses, which are legally issued in the issuing state, into an immigration status check. So let's take an example there, right? Maybe you have an H-2A seasonal ag worker driving a hay truck on I-25 with a Colorado commercial driver's license. This driver can be lawfully present, authorized to work, but the license itself doesn't say that. So if this driver is pulled over, presumed subject to 116, and held under the Laramie County Sheriff's Office's task force authority while officers verify their status. Ultimately, down the road, this misdemeanor charge, this misdemeanor crime, may not stick on their record, but the stop, the status check, and the risk of detention, that all happens anyway. The law, the Wyoming state law, and the 287G agreement are working together to manufacture those stops, which we'll talk about later. This scenario should deeply concern all of us because there are profound civil liberties implications at every stage in this process. There are equal protection concerns tied to racial profiling, there are due process violations, and there is the broader erosion of freedom to go about ordinary life without fear of government harassment. There is also the very practical cost for counties and for communities, because every single deputy hour spent carrying out a 287G operation is time and resources diverted from the responsibilities that local residents actually rely on law enforcement to perform. So there's one well-documented case in Arizona, for example, where a 287G participating sheriff's department missed its response time standard on 2/3 of life-threatening calls. We don't have this data in Wyoming yet, and that in and of itself is part of the problem. The public deserves transparency and data from law enforcement about the operational and human costs of these agreements.
Yeah, thank you, Libby. And I can share that from my own experience, racial profiling is very real. I've experienced it firsthand, and many people that I know have experienced it too, and it wasn't that long ago for me personally. I can tell everyone tuning in that everything you just mentioned creates genuine fear and anxiety across the community. Whether you're a fourth generation Wyomingite or you're here on a work visa moving mountains for your family. And by the way, you can listen to and view the entire quote that's on this, the quote that's on our slide, you can read that on our Instagram page. It's really powerful, heartfelt message and story. Yeah, check that out, Wyoming Voices. One point I keep coming back to here is that there's a reason that this program has been the most controversial piece of immigration enforcement for the last 15 years. We have the data. We've seen the impacts on families, public safety, civil liberties, and community trust. And it's happening again, faster and much bigger under the second Trump administration. The question for Wyoming is whether we want to repeat some of those harms here. Andrew, looking at you, from a different harm angle, what risks do sheriffs actually take on when they sign on to these from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, thanks for that, Antonio. It's a really important question because a lot of sheriffs sign these agreements thinking that they're just going to get blanket federal immunity, and that's both wrong and it can be an expensive misunderstanding. 287G deputized officers are treated like federal officers only for really narrow purposes. The more kind of default situation is that the county and its non-deputized officers, often the deputized ones too, they're the ones that remain liable for civil rights violations. It's in the agreement themselves that when the local law enforcement agency signs up, if a county sheriff signs up with this, they agree in the agreement that the liability is going to stay with them. And that's really important because there have been a lot of lawsuits against local law enforcement agencies because of their behavior under these agreements. There have been lawsuits because local officers under the agreements have been committing racial profiling, unlawful detention, and excessive force. But even if the local law enforcement agencies were not doing any of those things, ICE itself is making documented mistakes. And sometimes the local law enforcement agencies can get in trouble just for listening to what ICE is telling them because of ICE's mistakes. Libby mentioned the raid in Idaho earlier where people like U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents were detained. And that can happen because sometimes a local agency is going to be relying on ICE's what they call target list or detainers that they've issued. And if the local law enforcement agency, they do that without doing their own probable cause analysis, they're the ones that are going to own that constitutional violation. So the bottom line is really the financial and legal risk land on county taxpayers, not the federal government. The Wyoming counties are not insulated from that liability.
This is where I want to start talking about what many people on the call are here for. So far, we've heard about how the problem of 287G is growing across Wyoming and how that's directly harming communities. Andrew actually has been leading our legal work in this area, and I want to turn it to him again. Can you tell everyone how we're taking action? Can you start by telling us about the groups, the plaintiffs involved in the ACLU Wyoming lawsuit?
Yeah, definitely. Very excited to get to discuss this. As I think most of you probably know, on May 26th, the ACLU of Wyoming filed a complaint challenging the legality of the 287G agreements that Sheriff Kozak entered into in Laramie County. In a second here, I want to get into some of the details about the claims. But first, I do just want to say a huge thank you and to recognize our three plaintiffs. The plaintiffs, that's the legal term for the people we're bringing this lawsuit on behalf of. And I just want to tell you a little bit about all of them and how they've been impacted by these agreements in Laramie County. So our plaintiffs are Juntos, which is a local immigrants' rights advocacy organization, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Cheyenne, a local religious organization, and Drew's Barbershop, which is a local business. Now, all of these groups have been impacted by these agreements in different ways. For instance, Juntos has had to alter its long-term planning to respond to the impacts that they're seeing these agreements have. That includes a lot of things, like having to dedicate staff time to fielding calls from impacted community members. They say they've been getting 5 to 10 a week of people calling in. They're hosting information sessions about the agreements. They've also had to adjust their budget to create an emergency fund to cover things like rent, groceries, attorney's fees for the families that have been harmed by these agreements. That's just some of the ways that Juntos has been impacted. The Unitarian Universalist Church of Cheyenne, they actually had to create a new ministry that's called the Fire Ministry, or the Friends of Immigrants Responding Ethically. And it's a ministry that, once again, it provides direct support to people that have been impacted by this. And the church has had to do some extensive fundraising, and they've also had to redirect some of their existing funds to properly support this ministry, meaning that other issues that they want to be focusing on, to be directing funds towards, aren't getting the support that they hoped that they were going to be able to provide for them because they've had to redirect to respond to what's going on under these 287G agreements. Finally, there's Drew's Barbershop, local business in Cheyenne, and they had one of their barbers detained and deported because of these 287G agreements. Their barber, he had legal authorization to work in the country. He was a licensed barber. He was stopped by a sheriff's deputy when driving just because he had a non-working taillight. And then, using the authority that they had under the 287G program, the deputy detained him and he was ultimately deported. Losing him as a barber really impacted the business's bottom line to the point where they eventually decided to sell the business. And so that's some harms that each of these groups have experienced. But there's also just a larger harm that all of the plaintiffs have suffered, and that's been their inability to participate in any public comment period or any democratic process about whether the county should have entered into these 287G agreements in the first place. I just want to take a moment before I get into the details of the lawsuit to just thank all the plaintiffs for the work they've done to counter the harms that have been arising under the agreements. I also want to thank them for stepping up and agreeing to be plaintiffs in this suit in the first place. It's an incredibly brave thing that they're doing. We wouldn't have been able to bring this lawsuit if they hadn't agreed to publicly challenge these agreements. I really can't say enough about how much credit they deserve. And finally, I just also want to thank Hall & Lance, which is a law firm, and our local partners on the case.
Right on, Andrew. Thank you for uplifting those stories. It does take incredible courage to come forward like they did, especially in the current climate. We have so much gratitude towards them. So tell us more about the lawsuit itself, Andrew.
Yeah, so when you get down to it, this case is just really about whether Sheriff Kozak exceeded his authority under Wyoming law when he unilaterally decided to significantly expand the activities of the sheriff's office. We've already listed some of those numbers about just what a big expansion of the law enforcement this has been. And it's really important because there is a restriction in these 287G agreements in the federal law that allows these in the first place that says if a local law enforcement agency is going to enter one of these, they have to comply with all relevant state laws or the agreement is not valid. And what we're arguing here is that Sheriff Kozak violated 3 different state laws when he entered into these agreements. The first one, it's pretty clear that these agreements are contracts, and state law is very clear that it's county commissioners, not county sheriffs, who have the authority to enter into contracts. That's our first argument. And it's really kind of interesting because we've seen some things where Sheriff Kozak seems to know this, because in the past, just the last year, he wanted to enter into an agreement with a different federal agency, the U.S. Marshals, but a similar thing where he wanted to enter into a contract with a federal law enforcement agency. And there with the U.S. Marshals, instead of doing it unilaterally, he, worked with the U.S. Marshals, got an agreement, but then instead of doing it on his own, he took that to the county commissioners and got them to vote on whether or not to enter that contract. And he just did not do that here with these 287G agreements. So we say that's the first law that he broke. Second, as we already mentioned, these contracts just in their plain language require the sheriff to incur expenses. And just like with the power to contract, state law is clear that the power to incur expenses belongs with the county commissioners, not with the county sheriffs. So that's the second law we're saying, that he is incurring these expenses. And yeah, we've heard he's getting reimbursed at the moment. We don't know if that's going to continue, and he didn't have the authority to incur these expenses in the first place. So finally, we say that even if he did have the authority to enter contracts, incur these expenses, that he still violated the law because he didn't comply with something called the Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act. What that is it's this law that would have guaranteed that members of the community would have received notice of these proposed agreements and had an opportunity to comment on them before they were adopted as county policy. That law basically exists to make sure that before a local agency like the county sheriff does a huge expansion of the type of work they're doing, before they radically change something, that there is a system in place to make sure that people can be alerted to it and express their opinion on it. And so because the sheriff dodged these checks and balances, didn't allow residents the chance to weigh in, we argue that his office broke 3 different laws when they signed on to do ICE's work for them. Elected officials are not above the law, and we're asking the court to void these 287G agreements that Sheriff Kozak signed with ICE.
That's right. Officials are not above the law, and sheriffs are not above the law. So tell us how the lawsuit works. What happens now after filing?
Yeah. So, first thing to mention, always good to keep in mind when talking about lawsuits, is that they do not go fast. This is not going to be a very quick process. It's just not how the system works. You can think of this as could be a months to years long process, likely not one that's just going to be weeks long. It's just not the way it works. Litigation is rarely fast. And so, now we have filed, we've officially, served the sheriff, made sure he is officially aware of the lawsuit. And the way that the law works is he will now get a chance to respond. There's a few different ways that he could do that. So at the moment on our end, we're kind of in the ball's in their court moment with exactly what's going to happen next in the lawsuit. I can say, we'll be posting updates about any significant upcoming moments in the case. So if you want to follow along with its progress, please check out our website, our social media channels, and you'll be able to follow along with anything that's occurring. So I know I keep saying that it's not going to be quick, but I really do want to emphasize that the public attention that this lawsuit generates matters from day one, because what it's going to do right away, immediately, is force officials to defend their choices in public and on the record.
Exactly. Public attention and engagement is critical. Now, I'm sure this question is on a lot of people's minds right now. If we're successful, what changes? And what happens if we don't prevail?
Yeah, I'll be real upfront about it. We'll start with, what we're optimistic for if we win. So if we win, what we're asking the court to do and what they would grant us is to formally set aside the 3 existing 287G agreements in Laramie County. The ruling would apply to Laramie County. It wouldn't apply outside of there. But we would make sure that the existing agreements would not be in effect, and any future agreements would have to go through a real democratic process. There'd have to be public hearings, commission vote, public comment. And even though I said it would only be binding in Laramie County, the hope is that any win would have a real deterrent effect, that any other Wyoming county that has done this would look back, see if they had followed the proper procedure, and consider possibly if they'd be subject to a lawsuit to maybe changing their behavior, or if there's any county that's considering entering into one of these agreements and hasn't already, hopefully they'd think twice before letting their sheriff just sign on the dotted line without consultation. So that's the if we win scenario. If we don't win, the 287G agreements would stay in place in Laramie County. It's also possible that, give it make it a little tougher in the future to make similar challenges to sheriffs acting unilaterally for issues this big in the future. And so that's really the stakes, and it's really why public engagement matters even more before any court ruling comes in. It's important that a sheriff feels heat from his constituents and has a different calculation than one who might not be feeling that heat. But just either way, I really want to emphasize, this lawsuit is important, but it's just one tool. It's going to work alongside organizing, public education, know your rights training, pressure on county commissioners. This litigation isn't going to end the fight. It will open up more space for the rest of the fight to happen.
Right on, right on. I appreciate that framing, Andrew. Libby, Andrew, thank you both for all of that. There's so much more that we could get into, and that's exactly why we built in time, 30 minutes for questions from the audience. We want to know what's on your mind. My colleagues have been pulling questions from the Q&A, and if you haven't dropped yours yet, now's the time. So we'll get through as many as we can. All right, let me pull it up. First question. Assuming the ACLU wins, I don't see any reason to assume the local legislative branches wouldn't just rubber stamp an approval. Are these additional rounds of legal wrangling that can continue? Are there any additional rounds of legal wrangling that can continue to gum up the works and prevent harm to our neighbors and friends? Andrew.
Yeah. Just making sure I can see the question there real quick. So as I was just talking about, our lawsuit is not just about punting this until the local legislative agency, the county commission. We're also saying that whether this decision ultimately lies with the county commission or with the county sheriff, what's really going to need to happen is there needs to be a real process where the community has a chance to weigh in. That's what I was talking about, this Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act. So under that, there's going to be a really formal notice that's going to be required to come out. Then there's going to be a specific amount of time when people can respond and submit public comments. There's ways people can request a public hearing, so it's not just written comments. If certain things are triggered, the county would have to actually reply in writing to people's concerns. And it's just going to guarantee that this whole thing is much more open, democratic, and transparent. So this really isn't just about kicking it to the county commission. It's about making sure whichever agency is looking to pass this law, that they're doing so in a way that allows for public engagement.
Right on, right on. Our next question, sheriffs say 287G agreements promote public safety. Why are you against that?
Yeah, I can take that one. So, I have heard this claim a lot, and I'll be honest, I would really love to see the data behind the claim, because the published research, whether it's from the ACLU in our Deputized for Disaster report, our Safe Roads for All report, as well as other more comprehensive peer-reviewed studies, everything we have found points in the other direction, which is that 287G agreements do not enhance public safety and in fact undermine public safety. We've seen the communities that participate in 287G programs tend to see drops in 911 calls. They tend to see crime reporting go down, in particular from immigrant residents, which is frankly the opposite of public safety, right? We also have found that high volume traffic stops fail to reduce crashes, fail to reduce injuries or deaths on the road. Pulling Wyoming deputies away from interventions that actually save lives, I'm extremely skeptical that this does anything to enhance public safety. I think there was an example out of Crook County that was done in an excellent WyoFile report that showed that during one weekend, I think there were 4 ICE agents and deputies that stopped something like 50 trucks, right? They found 21 immigrant drivers and they arrested 4 of them. The other 17 were already in the process of complying with US immigration laws, renewing work visas, applying for citizenships. I believe even the sheriff in that county acknowledged that this operation was more ICE's priority than his office's. Finally, there is no evidence, and I mean no evidence, that immigrants commit crime at higher rates than US born citizens. That is settled empirically. So, a program that profiles by appearance and language is solving a problem that does not exist while creating real new ones. And I really think it's on all of us to really probe that public safety narrative when we hear it, because we hear it a lot and we're not hearing much data to back it up. We are not against public safety at the ACLU. We want our communities to be strong and safe, and we want them to be safe for everyone. And that's just what it is.
And I would just like to chime in there. Thank you, Libby. I couldn't agree more. But one of the things we're trying to highlight with this lawsuit is there wasn't a chance for an open public debate like this. There wasn't a chance for people to, where Libby said, I would like to see your data, here's ours. There wasn't a chance for that to happen. It was just the sheriff decided he wanted to enter into one of these and he signed it on his own. There was no chance for people to weigh in. And so we're trying to, again, make sure that this is more open, democratic, and transparent if a county chooses to adopt one of these, which we very much think they should not.
Right on, right on. And in those few months where all the people that arrested by ICE made it were people without criminal charges, that ain't keeping nothing or nobody safe. Let's jump to our next question. What's the difference between 287G and the normal cooperation local police already have with ICE? Why does signing one of these even matter?
I can go first, and then Andrew, if you have follow-up, throw it in. I think generally, so routine cooperation is very reactive and narrow. So if ICE asks a question, local law enforcement can answer it. What we have under a 287G agreement is different. It formally deputizes local officers to do federal immigration work themselves. It essentially changes the job description, especially under that task force model that the Laramie County Sheriff's Office signed. Deputies are now authorized to investigate immigration status out in the field, during traffic stops, at checkpoints, and anywhere they encounter someone they suspect. That is the opposite of reactive and narrow responding to an ICE question.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And just, it's also important. It's not like one of these agreements is signed and that immediately means that the local sheriffs can start doing this work. It's because it is such a radical change in the jobs that they are trained to do and what they're supposed to be doing every day in protecting the community. They have to go through a lot of additional training. It's not just the same as normal cooperation with ICE. It really, like Libby said, it radically changes the job description.
Yeah, and it changes how the community sees those law enforcement officers. Before it might have been somebody that they talk to, ask questions, and trust, and now they don't know if they can do that. Our next question: have you looked into Wyoming agencies with 287G agreements? Were they following or not following the procedures that your lawsuit against the Laramie County Sheriff's Office is highlighting? Andrew, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. We don't know for sure at this point what these other counties and like the Highway Patrol have done. I will say that last week we did send out to the 7 other counties that have entered into 287G agreements, as well as the Highway Patrol, open records request. And we said, hey, we want to make you aware, we have filed this lawsuit. You can, view it here. This is what we're claiming that Laramie County did wrong. Could you please send us records showing that you either complied with these laws or did not? So we don't know at this time, but it is something that we're actively looking into.
Right on. Thank you, Andrew. Let's see, our next question. You're saying the sheriff broke the law by signing these contracts without the approval of the county commission. But what about the people who are living here unlawfully? Does the law apply to them too?
The few different thoughts there. The first thing is just, the sheriff is accountable to his community. we're saying he broke from the county commission process by entering into these agreements. I keep saying no public debate, no input, and then he just does not have the authority to make a decision that consequential for all of Laramie County. But also, I really want to turn and address some pieces in that second part, the idea that people are living here unlawfully, the law applying to them. Simply being president in the United States without authorization is not a federal crime. It's a civil violation. We hear a lot of language like illegal alien, criminal alien. That framing is rhetorical. That's not how it appears in any law. It's not defined like that in, say, the Immigration and Nationality Act. And I just also wanted to highlight, the whole point of due process, which the Constitution guarantees, regardless of someone's immigration status, is that we don't prejudge who is or isn't lawfully here, just especially based on things like how someone looks or what language they speak. And so what we're seeing a lot of times is deputies short-circuiting that. U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, DACA recipients, they can get caught up in this too. We've seen it happen repeatedly under the current administration. And so, yeah, it's really important to put all that in context.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, no one deserves to lose their dad or their family because of something like that, and because the system is set up to be mostly impossible. Um, let's see. Why are we here? Next question is, why are you focused on Laramie County instead of Cheyenne or the Highway Patrol or one of the other 7 counties? Andrew, Libby, which would like to jump on that one first?
Yeah, I can definitely start off. I feel like hopefully touched on some of this already during the presentation, but as we talked about, we really have seen a lot of issues going on in Laramie County. As I said, it's one of only 2 counties in Wyoming that has signed all 3 of the 287G agreement types. It's just working as hand in glove as possible with ICE. And as I mentioned, also just how aggressively the sheriff is operationalizing these agreements. This is when we've seen, this is where the harm that the plaintiffs were able to point to. This is where they were able to come to us and say, we've been experiencing these harms. And again, we were able to look into this and in Laramie County see that these agreements were entered unilaterally. And so overall, that's why we really wanted to start focusing with Laramie County when we brought this lawsuit. Libby may have some additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add is that it's worth naming that Laramie County is home to about 17% of the state's population, right? And I think that when we think about impact litigation, one of the things that we really want to do is provide the biggest benefit to the largest number of people we possibly can. And a favorable ruling in Laramie County sends a really loud signal volume-wise and to the other counties that have signed these agreements. And like Andrew mentioned, we've sent these public records requests last week, so we'll see what we find out from those. But if other counties have made the same mistakes that Laramie County has, starting in Laramie County makes a lot of sense for sending a signal to other counties where they may have made a mistake, and will lead things in a way that I think will set things on a strong trajectory to hopefully correcting some of the errors that have been made.
And I'll also just add, this is where there's so much harm happening. Operations after operations, so many people. It's just one of the most enforced counties. So people are just being hit hard. Families are being ripped apart right and left. All right, our next question. If the lawsuit only applies to Laramie County, is it really worth the resources? Libby, I'm gonna kick it to you for that one first.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that. And the answer is absolutely yes. And here's why. Other states have seen single county or single agency challenges create not only success in litigation, but create the political space for broader rollback of programs that harm people's rights. Once you have a court that signals something is unlawful, like a court saying that unilateral 287G sign-ons are unlawful, other county attorneys are going to start advising their commissions and the boards they oversee differently. I think it's also important to think about sort of the public narrative and transparency effect, right? A lawsuit like this forces the sheriff and the county to defend these agreements in open court and on the record. That's information that the public did not previously have. because of the way the Laramie County Sheriff's Office approached these agreements. And, you know, even though I know sometimes in this political environment, in these modern times, people can feel sort of beat down by the heaviness that is happening and the harm that is happening. But I want to remind everyone that public pressure works and that change feels impossible until it happens, right? In just the last year, there are towns and counties in so many states, places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maine, that have reversed course on 287G agreements after public engagement. So this lawsuit, even though it's one lawsuit in one county, by raising this issue and showing what has been done wrong in Laramie County, I hope that folks are seeing and understanding 287G agreements, that they're seeing what has been wrong, not only with this process, but with this program in general and the harm it is causing, and that it inspires folks to stand up and take action. Because this is not a lost cause. This is not something that is a foregone conclusion. And there is action we can take to stem the tide and to stop the harm that is happening. I'm thrilled about this lawsuit because I believe it will lead to meaningful change. And I want to invite everyone to find ways to play a role in this in their communities, because it's going to take all of us. But I think we can all do this and we can make Wyoming better.
Right on. Thank you, Libby. And I'll just add to that, like Wyoming already said no to being part of a big immigration deportation machine. It was business owners, faith leaders, the whole community, the state was saying no, we don't want to be part of that. And I have no doubt that Wyoming's going to say the same thing this time. So let's jump to our next question. Sheriff Kozak says racial profiling will not happen in Laramie County. Why don't you believe him? I'm going to start on this one. So we've been doing a lot of research and diving into a lot of numbers. And based on the Laramie County Sheriff's own data and the Cheyenne PD's own data that's public on the crime map, if you live in a lower income, more diverse community, you're 3 times more likely to just be pulled over, and 4 times more likely to be arrested for going through a mental health crisis. I don't think people on the south side of Cheyenne are speeding any more than anyone else. To me, this shows a clear problem of racial profiling that's already happening, and their numbers even say it. So that's why I don't believe them, because it's numbers. Libby, Andrew, y'all got anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit. You know, I think 2 things can be true at once, right? We can take the sheriff at his word that no Laramie County Sheriff's Office deputy intends to racially profile. We can also know from decades of empirical research that 287G task force model operations consistently produce racial profiling regardless of the intent of individuals, right? That is precisely why the Obama administration phased out the task force model back in 2012. The mechanics of this program create the problem. Under Laramie County Sheriff's Office policy, officers can ask about immigration status after any lawful contact, which includes minor traffic violations and extends to passengers in the same vehicle, the same home, or on the same job site. So once race or language or accent becomes a cue for reasonable suspicion, the program is already doing what we said it would do. Community members in Cheyenne, including people in the process of receiving valid documentation, are already, like you said, Antonio, reporting that they've been pulled over for no apparent reason that they can see, and that their loved ones have been detained as a result. Laramie County Sheriff's Office says that they have not received such reports. The gap between those 2 things is meaningful, right? We can have people who are within law enforcement who do not have intent to profile, but when we're operating under structures and programs that are known to create conditions under which profiling happens, we have a problem. And that is one of the many reasons why 287G programs need to be put under a microscope and need to go through extremely thorough public vetting.
I agree with that. Right on. Thank you, Libby. Let's jump to our next question. If you find that other Wyoming agencies with 287G agreements have not followed the procedures that your lawsuit highlights, do you plan to bring legal action against them as well? Andrew, I'm gonna kick it to you for that.
Yeah, thanks. I can take this one. It's going to depend on a few things, but I can say we would definitely consider it. What certainly the hope is that, we're bringing the lawsuit here in Laramie County, and we would hope that any other county commissions, any other county governments who have entered into these agreements or are considering it are going to watch the lawsuit and see what a judge decides is the proper procedure that they have to follow. If we get to that point where we get a positive ruling and other counties are deciding that they don't want to, follow the appropriate judge-approved procedure, we would absolutely be considering filing lawsuits elsewhere. And I might just use this as an opportunity to say, I mentioned earlier just how much we appreciate our plaintiffs and that they stepped up from Laramie County and were willing to publicly challenge these things. And we would need that in other counties as well. So if you are in another county and you're being impacted by a 287G agreement, please reach out to us now. Please let us know. I can't guarantee we'll be bringing a lawsuit immediately, but I would love to go ahead and start speaking with you.
Right on. Thank you, Andrew. Our next question, how is this connected to what we are seeing nationally? The masked agents, the raids, the operations on people on the way home from the hospital. And I'll jump into this one real quick and then I'll kick it to you all. That's happening here. There are masked agents picking people up on Yellowstone in Cheyenne. There are masked agents picking people up at Maverick on the south side of Cheyenne. Like that's happening. So everything you see on the news is happening here. It's just quieter and more discreet. And making that a lot easier is the sheriff's doing ICE's dirty work for them. They're the ones that are picking up a large number of people and in the process of breaking trust with the community that they're stuck in. ICE ain't stuck here because they ain't part of our community. But yeah, it's all the same thing. It's happening here, it's happening there, it's happening everywhere. Libby, Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's connected very closely, right? 287G is the legal architecture under which local police can be integrated into federal operations, right? So the same week that Laramie County Sheriff's Office led the nation in those 287G arrests, ICE was also running checkpoints on the only highway into the Florida Keys, and they pulled over a 22-year-old cancer patient on her way home from the hospital. At the same time, in Idaho, those 200 federal, state, and local agents descended on the racetrack and zip-tied children. My point is that when local sheriffs sign these 287G agreements, they are not signing on to a clean federal program. They are signing on to operate alongside agents who are setting up checkpoints on highways, conducting warrantless arrests, and increasingly hiding their faces. The line between a Wyoming deputy and a masked federal agent disappears in those operations. That's also why the lawsuits are really starting to land. We are seeing active class actions over warrantless immigration arrests in North Carolina. We're seeing similar litigation in Oregon, DC, Colorado, and elsewhere. So what's happening nationally and what's happening here in Wyoming are very closely connected.
Yeah, very much. Thank you. And we're up to our last question. Folks, if you haven't got your question answered, please hit us up through social media or some way like that. We'll definitely get your questions answered down the road. All right. The ACLU sent Wyoming sheriffs a letter last year warning them about the impact of the 287G. How did sheriffs, especially Kozak, respond? Libby and
I think I can start this. I believe I was the one that sent that letter. So, before Laramie County entered into these agreements, we did send a letter out, really highlighting, our position that we think that these agreements cause harm in the community. We mentioned previous cases where local law enforcement agencies did end up being held liable for violations of, constitutional rights, and went through a lot of the things that we talked about, this evening, just why we think these are bad policy. And, asked the sheriff, please, let's, reach out to us if you want to discuss this more. This is kind of our position. And uh, I believe, he didn't get back to us directly, but I believe in the media, Sheriff Kozak said that by sending the letter, we were trying to intimidate him against doing his job, was his response. I don't remember it verbatim, but I think that was generally along the lines of what it was. And I can say that's certainly not what we were trying to do. Again, we were trying to inform him of, the risk of entering into lawsuits or entering into agreements like this, that it can lead to lawsuits. And again, clearly he decided to go forward, and that's led us to where we've now filed litigation.
Right on, Andrew. Thank you. And to everyone in the chat, like who's been putting in questions and stuff, just know that I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but we will be following up to make sure your questions are answered. All right, everyone. I want to respect everyone's time. So let's start wrapping this thing up. I wanted to thank Libby and Andrew again for sharing their expertise and time with us. And I really want to thank all of you for caring enough to show up on a Monday evening for conversation about civil liberties in Wyoming. Showing up matters, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And here's what I really want to leave you with. The 287G program in Wyoming did not appear out of nowhere. Sheriffs and Highway Patrol made choices. In Laramie County, those choices were made unilaterally, without public hearing, without county commission weighing in, without us. That means choices can be unmade. And that requires public pressure, sustained attention, and people who are willing to stay in the fight, like we did in all the years with the Wild Say No campaign. We also want to leave you with one way that you can get involved tonight. So add your name to the 287G Action Forum and pledge to help us stop the spread of these agreements in Wyoming. Add your name to join other Wyomingites who are against any efforts to use local resources such as jails and law enforcement officers to facilitate mass detention and deportation. The more people who take the pledge and sign on, the more leverage we'll have with decision makers in Wyoming. It only takes about 30 seconds, so please, if you can tonight, jump on and do that and share it out. You scan the QR code on the slide, click on the link in the chat, or you can go to the pledge website listed on the slide, listed on our slide, and you have your friends do the same. Please share it out, help us spread the word. When you pledge to take action with us on 287G, you'll also be added to our ACLU Wyoming email list if you want. This will help you stay updated on what's happening with the Laramie County complaint and other Wyoming updates. We'll also post the recording of this soon on our lawsuit page, which is also listed on this slide, and then we'll post it in the chat now too. Tonight, the thing I really want you to not forget is this 287G is reversible. They're not permanent. Other cities and counties have walked it back. Wyoming said no to this kind of immigration detention in the past. They did it because they organized for the neighbors. They did it for their neighbors, and they made it impossible to ignore. It was always out there. People were always talking about it because it hurt so much the state. This state and the people said no to private immigration prison once before. That time, they ran 2 private prison companies out of here, and we can do the same thing with these 287G agreements here in Laramie County and across Wyoming. Thank you for being part of that and for standing with us. Thank you to the ACLU team that made this happen. Thank you to Libby and Andrew. You give us hope, straight up. Thank you so much. To everyone watching, have a good night. Take care of yourselves. It's important right now to take care of each other, y'all. Never forget that solidarity will get us through. And peace and love, y'all. You have a good night.